Hello. Hello, madam. Now Shanti, madam, is host.
Yeah.
I change it.
Can we have more hosts?
1 second, I will check. Now I lost the this one, madam, admin thing. Now host can control the thing.
Can
Cause
we have two hosts? Vinay,
sorry.
you and Shanti, can both of you be
No,
hosts?
no, it won't be like that. Only one host.
Okay.
You're shuffling between host and hostess.
So Vinay, can we start now? I guess Shanti is recording the meeting. Shanti, can you confirm that?
Recording is happening in my system. Recording,
Okay,
you need to worry about that.
lovely. Okay. So good evening, everyone. And on behalf of the Eyebrow Club of Catholic Club, a warm welcome to you all as we have very eminent personality with us, another an infamous personality from the club who everyone has met and who is aware of as well. So before we start, let me, appreciate that you all taking time off on a Sunday evening to be part of this initiative. Today, we will be featuring the book A Forgotten Ambassador in Cairo, The Life and Times of Syed Hussein. And yes, Vinod, thank you for showing us the book. A Forgotten Ambassador in Cairo offers an illuminating narrative of Hussein's life, interspersed with historical details that landscapes a vivid political picture of that era to primary sources that includes Hussein's private papers, British intelligence files, and contemporary correspondence and newspapers. Mr. N.S. Vinod brilliantly brings to life a man who has been relegated far too long to the shadows of. Well, before I move on, we are proud to have with us at Catholic Club Mr. N.S. Vinod. Warm welcome to you. Uh, well, to give you a brief profile of himself, he's had his early education in Bangalore at our which school, Vinod, that you spoke about?
I was in St. Joseph's Boys High School and then at St. Joseph's College.
Amazing. So I think all of us must have come across you in one way or the other. And by the way, have you visited Catholic Club before?
Once a long time ago, not of late.
Okay.
Srini hasn't invited me yet.
So now you have more members to invite you there. And he obtained his degree in civil engineering from IIT Madras and then an MBA from IIM Lucknow. In his corporate career spanning 25 years, he's held senior positions in the field of corporate real estate with leading multinational financial services company like ANZ, Grindlays Bank, HSBC, and Fidelity Investments. He opted for an early retirement to start his own real estate company in Bangalore, as well as pursue his interest in traveling, his history, and writing. He is the author of A Forgotten Ambassador in Cairo, The Life and Times of Syed Hussein. He is married to Sheila, and they have two sons, Nikhil and Ashwin, both based in the United States. A warm welcome to you, Mr. N.S. Vinod, to be with us on this special day today. And, we've heard so much about you and your book as well. So we're so eager to hear more.
Thank you, Samira.
So Mr. N.S. Vinod will be in conversation with our own member from Catholic Club, Mr. Srinivas Kadur. Most of you, I'm sure, have seen him around the club. So Srinivas, when was your last Catholic Club?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
When was your last visit to the club, to Catholic Club?
Just the day closed for the lockdown. I
Okay,
came for a swim.
okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. So, yes, Srinivas Karur is a long-time Bangalorean, educated in Bangalore, and ran a business here till December 2006. He's been an agriculturist since, growing fruits in Magadi and Chikmagalur. Interests include reading and conversations with friends and others who catalyze thinking and analysis. Once again, a warm welcome to you both. And without further ado, we're going to leave the platform open to you both to discuss the book and share valuable insights, as a lot of our members have also shared that they found it really interesting and want to know more. So over to you both.
Thank you, Sudhir.
So, hi. Where would you like to start this evening?
I think let's start with why did I write?
Why did you write this book?
Why did I write the book? Yeah. Is the audio clear to everyone? Is the audio clear to everyone?
Yes,
I can
yes,
hear you.
yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that's a good place to start. Why did I begin this book? It actually happened as part of my travels. So my wife and son, we visited Cairo in March 2018, about 3 years ago. And the guide whom we had employed there said, look, do you want to see the tomb of an Indian envoy? So I said, okay, let's go see it. So he took me to the City of the Dead, which has thousands and thousands of tombs of various people. And then he stopped in front of a fairly large mausoleum. And he said that, look, this is the tomb of an Indian ambassador who was here. And then when I looked at the tomb inside, it was very badly maintained. I mean, the caretaker was using it as some kind of a storehouse. It was, very filthy. But the tomb, there was an inscription that it was the tomb of Syed Hussein, India's first ambassador to Egypt. And he died in Egypt in 1949. And what was strange was that this person had been buried in Cairo, and his body had not been brought back to India to be buried. So I was sort of intrigued by this person, and then I read up a lot about him, whatever was available, and he seemed to be a very fascinating man. And so what I thought would be initially a Facebook post eventually became a book. And the journey personally for me has been very interesting, because this is a man who actually traveled through 3 continents. He was in India, he was in the UK, and then he went to America, where he spent almost 25 years of his life. Did a whole lot of things in his life, to which I will come in due course. And this man's life has been very little known to Indian history. And that's the reason why I titled the book Forgotten Ambassador in Cairo, because he is a man who has literally been forgotten by Indian historians and Indian history.
In a sense, it was like visiting the pyramids and discovering pharaohs, unearthing, what would you say, interesting facets about a man long.
You could almost say that.
So what about man made you write a book? I mean, what were the interesting facets that kept stirring curiosity to go on?
So is your question, what was interesting about him that made me delve? Okay.
Progress on and on, from a Facebook post to a whole book.
Okay. Of course, I would obviously like everyone to read the book to know more about him. But the highlights were that he was born in a Nawabi family or a Zamindari family in Bengal. He had his education at the Aligarh Muslim University. And then he was known for both his prowess in writing as well as in elocution, in debating. And then he went to UK to study law, but he actually didn't study law. He in fact became a journalist. Came back to India, and became the assistant editor of the Bombay Chronicle under the famous journalist D.G. Horniman. Those of you who have lived in Bombay or been there and have heard about the Horniman Circle in the fort area, they would probably recognize that it has been named after Benjamin Horniman, who was a nationalist editor of the Bombay Chronicle. So Syed Hussain worked for him. And then after that, he became the editor of Motilal Nehru's newspaper in Allahabad, The Independent. So it was in Allahabad that his life took a complete change. He fell in love with Motilal Nehru's daughter. She was known as Sarup Nehru at that time, the later Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. They got married in secret, but this marriage was opposed by both Nehru and Gandhi. The marriage was annulled, and Syed Hussain was virtually exiled from the country for the next 25 years. So that was a turning point in his career where he was virtually banished from the country. Then he went to England as a member of the Khilafat delegation. Then he went to the United States. Exactly 100 years ago. He actually reached the US in October 1921. And there he fought for the civil rights of Indians, their fight for citizenship. And he also was Gandhi's representative in the US, fighting for India's independence. So on the whole, his career was very notable for being one of the very few Indians who fought for our freedom based on foreign shores.
Sorry, I didn't get what based on?
Based in foreign shores.
Would you say that your curiosity was stirred by marriage, a Muslim's marriage to Vijay Lakshmi Pandit as a starting point?
I think that was possibly a turning point in his career. The fact that as a Muslim, he fell in love with a Hindu girl. Given the society that they were moving in, and this was really upper class India, it was not just upper class, it was premium class India. I mean, Motilal Nehru was possibly amongst, the top or the richest 10, 15 Indians in the country those days, Western educated and so on. So I think when Syed Hussain and Sarup Nehru fell in love, they probably thought it was normal, but they didn't realize the amount of opposition that both her side of the family and Gandhi had to this alliance. And that, of course, was a very interesting part of the whole story, given that just about a couple of years before, Jinnah had fallen in love with a Parsi girl and he had married her, despite the opposition of the Parsi community. So they probably thought, at least these two must have thought, okay, they would probably have some opposition, but they probably did not anticipate that Gandhi himself would step in and ask them to annul the marriage.
Step in and step on.
I'm sorry?
I said step in and step on.
Yes, the marriage barely lasted 2 weeks.
Would you say the circumstances have changed in India today, 1920 to 2020?
It's a very loaded question. I think while in absolute numbers, inter-religious marriages may have increased, I think the psychological barriers between a Muslim marrying a Hindu or the vice versa, I think they continue to exist. So Gandhi himself wrote in his newspaper that while he was very supportive of Hindu-Muslim amity, he would stop well short of proposing a marital alliance between the two. And I think to a large extent that holds true in the country even today.
So much for free choice in the 21st century.
Well, it's not just inter-religious marriage, but even if you take inter-community marriages, I mean, there's a whole lot of restrictions. You have the Khap Panchayat, so on and so forth. So I think marriage is a very, very sensitive topic in India. And except for the anonymity which you get in urban India, rural India, I don't think has changed much.
Moving on to the substantive part of your book, it covers a lot of the Indian movement for citizenship in the United States at the turn of the last century. Uh, would you say that that was a digression, or you just kept finding more and more interesting details and that became a significant part of the book?
I think to understand Hussein's contribution, uh, not just to Indian independence, but also to Indians in the United States, it was necessary to give a context, a historical context of what he did in the US. And that context actually begins with the story of Indian immigration, which began in somewhere around 1904. 1904 was when the Sikhs from the Punjab went to both Canada and the United States as immigrant labor to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway as well as in the farms of California. So the first major immigration of Punjabi labor to the US and to Canada began in 1904. Starting from then, these people were subjected to an immense amount of racism and hatred, and which resulted in the race riots both in Bellingham and in Vancouver in 1907. Huge race riots, quite a few Indians killed, their homes were burnt, arson, and there was an immense amount of hatred against them both in Canada and in the United States. This actually culminated in the famous or the infamous Omagatta Maru incident. This was in 1914 when a shipload of about 300 Sikhs were prevented from disembarking at Vancouver Harbor just because they were Indians. They were actually made to stay on the ship for 2 months and the ship was turned back. This created, it was worldwide news and sort of brought out the racism that was prevalent in the US and in Canada against Indians. The next step in this was in 1923 in what was known as the Bhagat Singh Thind versus United States case, where Indians in the United States lost their right to citizenship. So even those Indians who had citizenship of the US, they lost it. And consequent to that, their property rights were taken away. So all the property that the Sardars had acquired, whether it was farms in California or whatever, were taken away from them. And again, as a consequence of this, their wives who may have been born American and were American citizens lost their citizenship rights because they had married Indians. So this had a whole lot of consequence of Indians losing citizenship, their wives losing citizenship, their property rights being taken away. This was the time. Syed Hussein reached the United States in 1921, and this case happened in 1923. So almost simultaneously with his landing in the US, Indians faced this kind of both a legal and a racist attack on their livelihood there. So Syed Hussein, along with some of the other Indians who were there, Indian leaders, took up this cause of Indian citizenship. They realized at that time that it is only because there was no government in India that supported Indians in the US that all this thing was taking place. Had there been a government in India of Indians which would have supported its people in the US, the racism may not have been so much. One contrast this with the Japanese. The Japanese government was strong. The Japanese supported their own immigrants in the US, and therefore they faced less racism than the Indians. So the realization began to sink in that Indian independence was one of the prime necessities to reduce racial attacks in the US. And therefore these two were actually concomitant. And therefore Syed Hussein and his fellow activists took up both these causes. Number one, freedom of India, simultaneously civil rights for Indians.
At the time Hussein went to the US, there was no differentiation of the subcontinent. There was only India, British India. How did the partition and the movement for, say, for example, separate electorates impact Indians living in the US, Muslim, Sikh, and Hindu? Were they driven by the same divisions, or were they able to see themselves as only Indian at that time?
I think this needs maybe a separate book or an enormous amount of research by itself. But from what I could glean from my research is that there certainly were differences in the US just as in India. I mean, the Sikhs didn't like the Hindus didn't like the Muslims, and the Muslims were not liked by anyone else. And the British exploited this to their own advantage. They sort of tried to drive differences within the Indian community in the US, but at least my reading doesn't lead me to believe that the differences were so stark as to for a partition movement to start in the US. That probably began in India much later when Jinnah took leadership in India. But I would say during the interwar years, that feeling was not so strong in the US.
Did you find any alliances between, say, the disadvantaged communities, Hispanics and Blacks, and people of color like the Indians and the Chinese and the Japanese? Did they form any kind of alliances? Was there any sympathy, conversation between them?
See, while the Chinese and other Asians, particularly the Japanese and the Koreans, faced a similar kind of a racist sort of attack as the Indians there, I did not find much evidence of cooperation between the Indian community and the other Asian communities. However, it was possibly in the late 1920s and the early 1930s when there was a significant sort of cooperation between the Indian community and the Blacks. One of the leaders was Baldwin, and I can see correspondence between the Indian leaders such as Anup Singh and even Syed Hussain, corresponding with the National Committee of Colored People in the US for cooperation in their need for civil rights. However, there was a significant difference between what the Indians wanted and what the Blacks wanted. The Blacks in America had already got their citizenship, and what they were really fighting for was equality as well as voting rights. However, the Indians were actually fighting for citizenship rights. So to that extent, their aims were a little different. And while there was a certain sympathy amongst them, I don't think they actually fought together for achieving their rights. It was quite two separate movements. There may have been a convergence of aims, but I don't think there was a convergence of action.
So it was another, like a generation for Martin Luther to find Gandhi.
Yes, I think the Blacks finally got their voting rights. I think it was in 1965. At the same time, when their women also got the right to vote. However, the Indians got their citizenship rights in 1945. So I think that fight was a little different from what the Blacks were fighting for.
You know, you have quoted a lot of primary in your writing. Was it difficult to access so much detail, newspapers, articles?
Srini, I lost you there. Can you repeat the question?
I said, 1 second. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
I was asking I was asking you, how difficult was it for you to access primary resources, newspaper articles, letters, etc.? How difficult was it for you to access these materials?
Um, some of the newspapers were online. So I did subscribe to the New York Times to be able to access their archives. But newspapers like what Syed Hussein edited, one was India, which was in the United Kingdom, and the second was the New Orient, which he edited in the US. Both these archival copies are available only in libraries. One is in the India House Library in the UK, and the other is in Columbia University Library in New York, as well as the New York Public Library. So during my travels to both London and to New York, I bought myself a membership of the British Library as well as the New York Public Library, and I was able to access this amount of material. Also, the British intelligence files, which were declassified sometime in 1977. This is almost about 1 million pages of British intelligence documents. All these have been photographed and are on microfiche. And this is again available in the British Library in London, as well as in Columbia University Library in New York. And this gave me a huge amount of material which I used in my book. So a lot of the stuff which I have researched on is primarily from libraries in both the UK and the US. Very little of this material was actually available in India for me to use.
Why is there such a huge lacunae on somebody so important in India? What would be your understanding?
That is what is one of the themes that I have sort of raised in my book as to why is this man forgotten. I have, of course, hazarded a couple of guesses. One is that he did fall foul of a powerful family in India. And I don't think Jawaharlal Nehru, when he became Prime Minister, really wanted to rake up this whole, sort of the blot on his family's history by giving Syed Hussein any importance. So he came back to India in 1945 from the US, and then he was sent off to Cairo as Indian ambassador there, out of the country, out of sight. But what is surprising is that even after his death, there has been absolutely no attempt to memorialize him in any way. Like I say, not a pylon, no locality, nothing is named after him. There is not even a mention in the papers of the External Affairs Ministry about him. In fact, a lot of ex-ambassadors to Egypt had not heard of his name. And that is what was surprising. I mean,
you're treading on dangerous ground.
So I guess, that was what was most surprising to me, that a person so eminent who had done so much for India had completely been forgotten in this country.
You think it is also because he could never have been accepted as a Muslim leader like Maulana Azad, that he was too secular?
I think you did have very secular Muslim leaders at that time. Maulana Azad, one of them, Asaf Ali was another one. And of course, Syed Hussein was, belonged to that crowd of people. But I think the majority of Muslim leaders in India did migrate to Pakistan after partition. And they were actually, in a sense, secular. And I think India was possibly a loser for having lost this set of very eminent Muslim leaders to Pakistan.
Are you saying that leaders from within the Congress also migrated to Pakistan?
They were, let's look at the second level of leadership. Let's take even Syed Hussein's immediate family. His sister's husband, Ikramullah, became the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. He was an admirer of Jinnah, but he became Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. So these were the kind of leaders, secular Muslims, maybe highly educated Muslims who migrated to Pakistan. And to that extent, I think India was to a certain extent the loser because we lost that, the erudite secular Muslim leadership went away from here. And obviously their position was taken by more radical people.
From across the border.
And even from within.
How do you see your book? Do you think that it, in some way, it could build scholarship for research into forgotten personalities like Hussein?
I would actually hope that my book encourages further research into the immigrant history of Indians, not just to the US, but to other parts of the world too. Which I think is a part of Indian history that has not been so well told, at least in India. There are actually very few books on the Indian immigrant history available even in the US. Not more than three or four books. And especially the history after the Second World War, that is after 1940, has not been told at all except in some academic papers. I would actually say that my book is possibly the first one that talks about this part of the history after 1940. And I definitely think more research, more scholarship is required for this period. There was an enormous amount of stuff that happened, by Syed Hussein, J.J. Singh, and other people, which is a story that is very interesting, but has not been told in India yet.
Or even in the US for that matter.
Or even in the US, that's right.
There is a kind of a question from one of the audience.
Mm-hmm.
It relates to the possibility of Syed Hussein being an interlocutor between Nehru and Jinnah. Was that a possibility? Was there a possibility to build bridges?
Syed Hussein did attempt it. He did visit India in 1937 and did try to talk to both Jinnah and Nehru about it. But I think at that time, things had gone a little too beyond for Syed Hussein to be of any use at that time. And even after his return to India in 1945, he did make some attempt, but I think it was far too late for any kind of intervention to reverse the process of what Jinnah wanted. Jinnah wanted a separate country and he got it.
Do you think if he had not been exported to the US, he could have made some kind of difference to the trajectory of Muslim politics in India, undivided India?
Possibly. And I strongly believe that he could have been an efficient foil to Jinnah at that time. But again, these are hypothetical questions. All of these what if questions in history have various answers. But I definitely think he could have had an influence, yes.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to tell us about the journey that you've taken and become, in a way, Mr. Hussein's companion, walking him back into the limelight?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey because I try to follow his journey in terms of the places he went to. I went to Calcutta, saw the house which I think he was born in. I visited Allahabad, the place where he fell in love with Vijayalakshmi Pandit. I went to London, saw the house of his lady love. All this is described in my book. So, and saw the Inns of Court. Then I went to New York, had lunch at his favorite restaurant, which of course has had a succession of different owners since his time, but it's located at the same place. It's now called I think Curry India. It was known in his days as Ceylon India Inn, and it's quite a famous place. And yeah, so for me personally, it was a very interesting journey. I met a lot of interesting people. I met his nephew. I had a meeting with Nayanthara Sehgal, who is Jawaharlal Nehru's niece, who lives in Dehradun. And of course, many more people on the way. So personally, it's been a very, very satisfying journey for me.
What would your next book be about and where would you be going?
Not yet. I think I need to start traveling. So should we sort of take questions from the audience, from the group?
Yeah, so if there's anybody who wants to ask a question, kindly do so. I think Brian, I think you have been following this book for quite some time and the conversations. Do you have any question? Or anyone else? Anyone? Don't feel shy and unmute yourself, please, when you're asking the question. Please unmute. I think Padmini, I can see there's some active. Can you unmute yourself and speak?
Yeah, this is Bami Patel from Hyderabad. And I would like to ask a question to Vinod. Do you think that there may be some karma attached to your getting involved with Syed Hussain? Some kind of a karma?
I really don't know, but but when I sort of look back on my journey, the coincidences that happened were far too many. So I possibly think that there might have been some kind of a divine hand, or maybe Syed Hussein's hand that was direct to me in some ways. I mean, the coincidences was just far too many. I mean, I was just looking at a blog and I found his nephew's email address. So I wrote to him and he provided me with a lot of material. I was doing some research at the Nehru Memorial Library and I have historian Ramchandra Guha sitting next to me who provided me with a lot of information, contacts. I mean, he's a historian of repute and he was throughout my advisor. And, things like this, far too many coincidences. And yeah, I guess your question is right. Yeah, there could have been some karma.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Oh yeah, please do.
I'm sure Srini will send us one of your copies autographed by you. Yeah.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else? Anybody else who wants to ask a question? I wanted to know, why has the Muslim community ignored him? Is there any reason, or have they done something to honor him in India?
Not at all. I think he was pretty much unknown. So if you see the politics of that day, let's take 1947, 1948. Generally, I think there was a certain amount of animosity in the country towards Muslims. The Hindus did feel that because of partition. And he was not an established Muslim leader in India. He was in the US, and there was some amount of criticism against him that he led a life of comfort in the US while the people here suffered imprisonment, so on and so forth. So to that extent, he was not loved by the Hindus. He was not loved by the Pakistani Muslims because they thought that he was a bit of a traitor, because they expected him to come to Pakistan along with the rest of the family. But he believed in a united India, so he stayed back in India. So to that extent, I don't think the Muslims really cared much for him. So with the result that, look, everyone forgot about him. And he didn't have a sort of a mass following in India, unlike other Muslims, other Muslim leaders who were here from the very beginning, like a Maulana Azad or an Asaf Ali. So I think things were just stacked against him and everyone conveniently forgot about it.
What about our NRIs in the US, since he fought for their citizenship rights? He doesn't
Equally,
seem to...
I mean, this story has not been written about. Believe me when I tell you that, when I asked a few of my friends, I mean, these are my contemporaries, people who are in the 50 to 60 age group who migrated to the US, at the beginning of the IT boom in the early 1980s. Have they heard of this story? almost none of them have heard of this story.
Wow.
So there is a huge amount of ignorance even in the US amongst the Indians of their own immigrant history. And that is what is a little sad.
Yes.
But you know, Omagatta Maru came out as an Amar Chitra Katha comic. I remember reading it in school.
I mean, there were Indian leaders like Hardayal or Taraknath Das who did an enormous amount for the Indians out there. How many people remember them? I mean, had they been in India, their contribution would have been recognized and probably been fitted as freedom fighters, maybe a painting of them in parliament or whatever. But they have all been absolutely forgotten. And my book gives the history of a lot of these people, their contributions. It's sort of an attempt to resurrect them in some ways.
Okay, there's a question.
Yeah.
There's a question from Jen. Vinod, how long did it take you to write this book? And what or who prompted you to delve deeper and write this book?
As I said, I traveled to Cairo in March 2018. And my reading began from then onwards, the research. So, and the book was published this January, but the manuscript was ready last April. So I would say it was about 2 years of intense research with a lot of travel in it for the research. And really speaking, there was no one who prompted me. This was just something which, it was almost like a labor of love. I just felt that I had to write the story, not just about Syed Hussain himself, but of the Indian immigrant history. So it was a story waiting to be told.
Are there any other historical romances in your list, in your upcoming?
Not yet. I'll have to fish for them. But okay, as an anecdote, I would like to relate this. Syed Hussein's grandniece, that is his sister's granddaughter, she is the Princess of Jordan, Princess Sarwat, who's married to Prince Hassan, who's the brother of the ex-king, King Hussein. So she's of the royal family and she's Syed Hussein's grandniece. So after my book was published, I think she sort of came to know that Syed Hussein's tomb was in a very bad state in Cairo. And she took it upon herself to have this tomb cleaned up. And then, of course, through someone else, she sent me a video of the tomb as it is now. She has had it cleaned up and she has appointed her staff to get a quotation and all that to renovate the tomb and maintain it in future. So to that extent, I'm happy that my book in some way has led to the preservation of this man's tomb. So that's an interesting aside, which I just wanted to share.
Last chance, anyone would like to raise it? I think Srini has asked one of the questions on the group. Was Gandhi's opposition to the marriage of Syed and Swarup Nehru surprising to you?
Yes. Actually, what was more surprising to me was not just the opposition of Gandhi to the marriage, but what he wrote about it in Young India, which is the newspaper that he used to edit, where he was pretty categorical in that he said Indo-Muslim amity does not extend to marriage between the two communities, and that he objected to that. That statement of his was the most surprising for me.
I mean, I don't know if times have changed. I hope marginally, at least, they have changed.
I hope so.
Yeah.
You think Gandhi would have revised his opinion post-partition?
See, I mean, few examples, he did object to his son getting married to a Muslim. Though he blessed the wedding of Asaf Ali with Aruna, he was quite okay with that. And maybe a couple of other cases later on. He probably maybe changed his opinion, but I'm not quite confident of saying that.
So we are almost come to the end of our interesting session. Is there anybody else who would like to speak or ask a question? If not,
Auntie, I have a
we can.
question, Vinod.
Yeah. Rohini, please speak.
Vinod, what words of advice would you give to somebody who may be interested in writing a book that's based on historic facts?
Look, this is my first book, and I don't think I really feel confident to give advice. But I think there are two pieces at least which I followed rigorously. One was to get to primary sources and not just rely on something which someone has written about someone. I think it's necessary to go to primary sources because that is what lends authenticity to your research, which is the reason I was very, very keen on getting to newspapers. Newspapers, interviews which people gave, meeting people, interviewing people. So these actually, I think, lead to the authenticity of the book. So that is one thing. The second was, how shall I put it? The need to be objective as far as possible. And I say as far as possible because it's, I think, entirely impossible for someone to be free of biases, but try and keep those aside for as much as possible. I think these are the two, because otherwise the book will lack credibility if people see that you're sort of tilting in someone's favor. Yeah, I think that's what I would advise.
Thank you, Vinod. Anyone else with a question? Okay, so we have come to the end of a very interesting discussion. So thank you for giving us those insights into the life and times of Syed Hussain. I almost feel sorry for the man. You know, his star-crossed love affair, banished to the States, and then to die in Cairo, unknown, almost unwanted, you know, by the people in India and the people in the US for whom he fought for citizenship rights, as well as writing all those letters and being behind the Indian independence movement from afar. So thank you for shedding a light onto the life of Syed Hussain. I'm sure he must be smiling from afar that you have, you know, dug into his life and you know, given us an insight into what you could do. So thank you so much, Vinod, and thank you everyone who has joined this interesting discussion. I think.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking to all of you. So if there is anything, you know, you can always post a question on the group. I guess I'll be on the WhatsApp group for some more time. So please feel free to ask me questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Samira, are you there or is Samira? Okay, I think. So thank you, Vinod. Thank you everyone for joining in.
Thank you. Bye.